A pale mist clung to the earth as dawn broke over a desolate village, nestled in the heart of a once thriving region now ravaged by the brutality of war. The sun, a pale and weary orb, barely pierced through the heavy clouds, casting an ashen hue over the broken landscape. Shattered buildings, their once proud structures now reduced to piles of rubble, lined the streets. Abandoned vehicles sat like forgotten relics of a time long past, rusting slowly under the weight of the conflict that had swept across Europe. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, lingering from the fires of battles fought and lost, and the distant rumble of artillery fire added a foreboding rhythm to the silence. In the center of the village, a group of young German soldiers stood in a rough, disordered line. Their faces were gaunt and pale, eyes sunken deep into their skulls. They were mere boys, no older than 16 or 17, yet their bodies betrayed the weight of years they had never lived. They wore the tattered remains of their uniforms, stained with dirt, blood, and the remnants of their country's once proud insignia. The once vibrant colors of their insignia had long since faded, bleached by time and battle, leaving only the jagged, almost indiscernible patches of their nation's symbol. The boys stood in tense silence, their feet cold against the frozen earth beneath them. Their hands, clasped tightly in front of them, shook uncontrollably, not from the cold, though the air was frigid, but from the all-consuming fear that gripped their hearts. The last few months had been a blur of chaos, starvation, and loss. They had been pulled from their homes, thrust into the heart of a war they never truly understood, and forced to march, fight, and die in the name of a regime whose promises of glory had turned to dust. The world they had known before the war, before the horrors of battle and the devastating weight of their country's decline, seemed so distant now. Their memories of family dinners, schoolyard games, and the warmth of their homes had been swallowed by the relentless march of time. They were no longer children in the sense that they had once been, yet they were far from the hardened soldiers they were expected to be. In a sense, they had become ghosts, moving through a world they no longer recognized, tethered only by the bonds of fear and desperation. Their eyes flickered nervously around the group, as if hoping for some sign, some word, some reassurance that what was happening around them was not real. But nothing came. The fear was all-consuming, gnawing at their insides with the kind of hunger they had not known since the early days of the war, when food was still plentiful and the promise of victory was a tangible thing. Now, it was only hunger that consumed them, hunger for food, for water, for safety, and for the end of this madness that had torn their world apart. Above them, the sky was a dull gray, its lifeless color echoing the emptiness they felt inside. They were trapped, caught between two forces that seemed beyond their control, the British soldiers who had captured them and the brutal, unforgiving war that had taken everything from them. The boys knew little of the battles that had raged before their capture. All they knew was that they had been swept into the tide of history, thrown into a conflict that had turned them into pawns in a game they didn't understand. The British soldiers who held them captive stood several yards away, a silent line of hardened men. Their uniforms were neat, their postures stiff, betraying the discipline that had been drilled into them over the course of their own harrowing experiences. The young German soldiers could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the weariness of men who had fought for years, who had seen comrades fall in battle and who had watched the world around them burn. Yet, there was something else in the eyes of the British soldiers, something that the boys could not place at first. It wasn't the coldness they had expected from their captors. There was no malice in their gaze, no hint of the violence they had been taught to expect. Instead, there was a strange mixture of pity, resignation, and something almost foreign to the boys, sympathy. As they stood there, waiting for the inevitable, they heard the unmistakable sound of British laughter, laughter that seemed entirely out of place in the midst of such a grim scene. The boys flinched, unsure of how to interpret it. Was it mocking them? Ridiculing their defeat? Or was it something else entirely? The British soldiers, whose faces had been etched with the weight of countless battles, now seemed lighter. They were laughing amongst themselves, sharing jokes, teasing one another as if they were gathered in a pub back home, and not on the front lines of a war that had taken so much from them all. At first, the boys could not understand it. Laughter in the face of defeat, in the midst of war, it was a strange, almost obscene thing. How could these men, who were supposed to be their enemies, behave so casually, so humanly, in the face of such devastation? It was as if the lines between good and evil, friend and foe, had been blurred beyond recognition. The boys stood frozen, their minds racing to comprehend the scene unfolding before them. They had been trained to hate the enemy, to view them as less than human, as mere obstacles to their own survival. But this was not what they had expected. The laughter broke through the tense silence like a sudden gust of wind, disrupting the stillness of the moment. The sound was disorienting, jarring, and it seemed to linger in the air long after it had faded. It was as if the very nature of the conflict itself had shifted, turning the boys' world upside down. They had expected violence, cruelty, pain, and they had certainly been prepared for all of it. But this was something they had never been taught to expect. It was not the laughter of an enemy triumphant, but of men who had been broken by the war just as much as they had. One of the boys shifted uneasily on his feet, his stomach growling with hunger, but it was not just hunger that gnawed at him now. It was confusion, fear, a growing realization that the enemy they had been taught to despise, the men who had taken everything from them, were no longer the faceless monsters they had imagined. In fact, they were just as human as they were. And that thought, that terrifying thought, began to sink into the boys' minds with the weight of 1,000 regrets. What had they been fighting for? Who were they really fighting against? Were they so different from these men, these soldiers, who had suffered the same pain, the same loss? As the laughter continued, it became clear to the boys that the line between captor and captive, between enemy and ally, was not as clear as they had once believed. Their world had been shattered, their understanding of the war, their place in it, had been upended. They were no longer just soldiers, locked in a bitter conflict for the future of their country. They were young men, lost in the chaos of a world that had been destroyed, struggling to make sense of a reality that had become impossible to understand. The laughter faded into silence once more, but the impact of it lingered in the air. It had been an unexpected twist in the story of their captivity, a moment that had torn apart the script they had been living by for so long. They had been prepared for hatred, for violence, for retribution, but they had not been prepared for this. And in that silence, as they stood together in the ruined village, the boys realized that everything they had once known about the enemy, and perhaps about themselves, was about to change forever. The moment of laughter was not just strange, it was disorienting, almost like a shard of light in a world of shadow. The young German soldiers stood frozen, their eyes darting between one another and the British soldiers before them. The laughter was not what they had expected. They had been taught, from the moment they were inducted into the war, that their enemies were not men but faceless figures, dehumanized and stripped of their humanity. The constant propaganda had painted the British, along with their allies, as cold, merciless foes who would stop at nothing to crush their nation's spirit. This lightheartedness, was foreign, almost obscene, in the context of everything they had been led to believe. The British soldiers who had been standing in formation just moments before, now seemed to let down their guard entirely. They were laughing openly, sharing jokes, speaking to one another in relaxed tones that contrasted sharply with the tense, heavy atmosphere surrounding the young German prisoners. The sound of their laughter echoed across the desolate street, filling the emptiness of the village with an unanticipated sense of warmth. It was not the laughter of a victor gloating over a defeated enemy, but something far more perplexing. The British soldiers seemed to have shed their armor, both literal and metaphorical, and in its place, there was an openness, an almost absurd joy that disrupted the very nature of the situation. The boys, still lined up before them, had no idea how to react. They had been stripped of their dignity, their sense of self-worth eroded by the ravages of war. They had been told by their commanders that they were the last line of defense, the final hope for the Reich's survival. Yet here they stood, vulnerable, frightened, their futures hanging in the balance, unable to grasp what was unfolding before them. They expected harsh words, insults, perhaps even violence. They had prepared for every possibility, except this. They were not just prisoners. They were children caught in the aftermath of a war that had stripped them of their innocence, and the laughter that filled the air now seemed like a mockery of that lost youth. As the laughter continued, One of the British soldiers stepped forward. His face was weathered and tired, and he wore the marks of someone who had seen too much of the war's brutality. He was not young, perhaps in his late 20s, his face a map of hard-earned wisdom and pain. His uniform was slightly disheveled, as if he had not bothered with the usual meticulous care given to military dress. In his eyes, the boys could see something that they had not expected: understanding, empathy, and weariness. There was no malice, no gleam of triumph, just an exhaustion that spoke of battles fought long after the heart had become numb to the horrors they had witnessed. "It's just that you boys are so young," the soldier said, though his words were not directed at anyone in particular. The words were an admission, a moment of shared vulnerability, as if he, too, were acknowledging the madness of the world they were all trapped in. There was no animosity in his voice, no venomous edge that the boys had been taught to expect from their captors. Instead, there was something else, something quieter, more disquieting in its gentleness. The laughter, though, still lingered. The British soldiers were smiling now, more subdued, but still exchanging words and glances among themselves. It was as if they had forgotten for a moment that they were standing at the end of a long, brutal conflict. As the boys stood in their line, eyes wide and mouths dry, they struggled to process the shift in the dynamics of war. Were these men really their enemies? Was this the same British army that had been painted to them as ruthless, godless invaders, hell-bent on the destruction of everything their nation had fought for? They could not reconcile the image of these soldiers laughing, as if they were nothing more than neighbors sharing a drink, with the image of an enemy they had been taught to loathe. The boys exchanged confused, uneasy glances. They knew their predicament. They had been captured during a retreat after their battalion was overwhelmed by Allied forces. They had been fighting for survival, but now, as prisoners, they were helpless. Their futures were uncertain. It was not the act of being captured that troubled them. It was the fact that their captors were acting in ways they had not been prepared for. They had expected cruelty, an enemy who would revel in their defeat, perhaps inflict more pain to further punish them for their losses. But instead, they found themselves caught in a bizarre moment of camaraderie, one that shattered their preconceived notions of the enemy. One of the boys, a slender young man with deep-set blue eyes, dared to speak. His voice was hesitant, barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves might betray him. "What are you laughing at?" he asked, his throat tight. His words hung in the air, awkward, even childish in their simplicity, but they were born from the confusion and fear that gripped him. The British soldier who had spoken earlier turned his head slightly, meeting the boy's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, only a sort of weariness that the boy had seen mirrored in the faces of his own comrades. "It's not about you," the soldier replied. "It's just a bit of madness, isn't it? After all this, we're still here. Can't help but laugh." He gestured to the surrounding destruction, the ruined homes, the shattered lives. The irony was impossible to ignore. The soldiers who had been through hell were still standing, while the world around them had crumbled into ruin. The laughter was an attempt, however feeble, to hold onto something human in the midst of the chaos. The young German soldiers stood in stunned silence, processing the meaning of those words. The irony was not lost on them. The soldiers before them, who had been fighting for years, had endured the same suffering they had, perhaps more. Yet here they were, on opposite sides of a war that neither side truly understood or controlled, both trapped in a cycle of violence that had no end. The question hung in the air: who were the true victims of this war? As the laughter died down, the boys felt a strange emptiness settle in their chests. The bitterness that had once filled their hearts, an anger directed at their enemies, a belief in the righteousness of their cause, began to fade, replaced by something more insidious: doubt. Doubt about their mission, about their leaders, about the very fabric of the war that had defined their lives for so long. They had been taught to see the British soldiers as monsters, as invaders who sought to destroy everything they held dear. Yet, here they were, sharing a moment of human connection in the midst of everything that had fallen apart. The British soldiers began to disperse, still smiling, but their expressions were more somber now, as if the laughter had somehow drained them of the last remnants of hope they had left. The boys stood silently, their hands still trembling as the sounds of war continued to echo in the distance. The brief, absurd moment of levity had passed, but it left behind a lingering sense of disquiet, one that would follow the boys for days to come. In that fleeting moment, everything had changed. The enemy they had been taught to hate, the enemy they had been trained to destroy, was no longer the faceless monster they had imagined. The lines between friend and foe, good and evil, had blurred. The laughter was not just a symbol of a fleeting moment of peace, it was a profound disruption in the story they had been told. The boys were no longer sure of their place in the world, no longer certain of who the real enemy was. The war had stolen their innocence, but in this moment, it had also given them something far more unsettling, the knowledge that the true cost of war was not just the lives lost, but the humanity that was lost on both sides. As the laughter faded, the silence that enveloped the village grew heavier. The young German soldiers, still standing in their disarrayed line, felt an almost suffocating weight descend upon them. The tension that had been so thick just moments before, when they had expected to face their captor's cruelty, had dissipated, but it left behind an uneasy emptiness. What had been a moment of tension, of fear, anger, and desperation, had morphed into a surreal, disjointed scene that no one could fully grasp. The British soldiers moved away from their formation, some walking to the edge of the street to light cigarettes, others murmuring to each other. They seemed to be talking not about strategy or victory, but about mundane things: the weather, the state of their boots, the food they had eaten the night before. It was a startling contrast to the war-worn image the young German boys had carried in their minds. These soldiers, whom they had been taught to despise and fear, were now engaged in the kind of small talk that could only exist in a world untouched by war's endless violence. And then something else happened, something that seemed entirely out of place, but in that moment, felt oddly fitting to the fractured reality the boys found themselves in. A British soldier, older than most of the others, approached them with something in his hands. It was a small bundle of bread, wrapped in a cloth, and a tin of what looked like meat, likely corned beef or a similar rationed food. The sight of it made the boys' stomachs lurch. They had not eaten anything substantial in days, perhaps weeks. Hunger had become their constant companion, gnawing at them from within, so familiar that it had begun to feel like a permanent fixture of their existence. It was the one thing they could count on in the chaos, the emptiness inside their bodies that mirrored the emptiness around them. The soldier stopped a few paces in front of them, holding out the bread and the tin. He was smiling slightly, but there was no triumph in his expression, no gleam of victory. Instead, there was something far gentler, a softness that seemed to come from a place of shared experience, from understanding the terrible price of survival. The boys stared at the offering for a long moment, unsure of what to do. The act was so simple, yet so profound, that it shook them to their core. They had been captured, stripped of everything, honor, dignity, and hope, and now they were being offered food. The very thing they had lost faith in, the thing they had been denied for so long, was being given to them by the very people they had been taught to hate. At first, none of them moved. The soldiers had been ruthless in their training, conditioned to accept suffering, to endure hunger, to fight and die without question. But this was not part of their training. They had been told that the enemy would never show mercy, that they should never expect kindness from the forces that opposed them. But here, standing before them, was a man, an enemy soldier, offering them food, without an ounce of mockery or malice. The contradiction was overwhelming. How could this be the same enemy they had been taught to despise? How could this be the same force that had decimated their country, that had forced them to take up arms against their will, to kill or be killed? The youngest of the boys, a thin, pale-faced soldier who couldn't have been more than 15, took a step forward. His movements were hesitant, unsure, as if he feared that even accepting the food would somehow be a betrayal. He looked at the soldier, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and disbelief. The British man smiled again, more warmly this time, and took another step closer, holding out the bread even farther, as if to assure the boy that it was meant for him. The boy glanced at his comrades, their faces etched with a similar sense of unease, and then, with trembling hands, he took the food. The moment the bread touched his fingers, the boy's body seemed to collapse in on itself. He wasn't crying, at least not in a way that could be easily seen, but his entire posture shifted. The weight of the gesture, the overwhelming sensation of being fed, of being seen as something other than a threat, something more than just another soldier to be vanquished, was more than he could bear. The world around him blurred for a second as the warmth of the bread in his hands grounded him in a reality he could scarcely believe. In that brief, strange moment, it wasn't just the food that broke him. It was the realization that his captors, the men who had come to represent everything he feared, were human too. They were not just the enemy, they were people with families, with their own struggles, with their own hunger and pain. The other boys, who had been watching intently, followed suit. One by one, they reached for the bread and the tin of meat, their eyes still wide with disbelief. The food was simple, nothing special by the standards of what they had once known, but it was more than enough. They devoured it hungrily, the bread dry and crumbling in their mouths, the meat salty and rich. It didn't matter. Their stomachs had long been empty, their bodies weakened by months of deprivation. The taste was less important than the fact that they were eating at all, that for the first time in weeks, their hunger was being addressed by someone other than their own desperation. They chewed quickly, too quickly, as if afraid the food would disappear if they didn't finish it fast enough. The British soldiers stood around them, their faces softening as they watched the boys eat. They said nothing, but there was a shift in the air, a collective understanding that transcended the battlefield, an unspoken recognition that they were all victims of the same terrible war. For the German boys, the act of eating was more than just a physical need being met. It was the first crack in the wall that had been built around their perception of the war, their perception of their captors. The food was a gesture of mercy, yes, but it was more than that. It was a sign that their captors saw them not as the enemy, but as human beings, struggling to survive just as they were. The hunger that had once defined them, had once been the only thing that linked them to their identity, began to ebb away, replaced by a quiet, uncomfortable awareness. The boys had come to believe that the enemy was cold and unfeeling, that they were alone in their suffering. They had been told that their pain was a noble one, a sacrifice for a greater cause. But now, standing in front of them, was the stark truth. They were not alone in this suffering. The British soldiers had endured their own hardships, had watched their comrades fall, had fought their own battles with hunger, fear, and loss. They were not so different from the boys themselves. And so, as the boys ate, something profound began to unfold within them. The initial bitterness that had surged within them as they faced their captors began to dissolve. Their hatred, the deep-seated animosity they had been taught to feel toward the British, started to feel misplaced, hollow. What had they been fighting for? What had they believed in, when everything they had been taught now seemed like a lie? They had been told that they were soldiers of honor, fighting for the future of their nation. But in this moment, that sense of honor seemed less important than the simple act of surviving, of sharing a meal with those they had been told were their enemies. They had come to this village with fear in their hearts, expecting punishment, pain, and death. But what they had found instead was a kind of humanity they never expected. As the last crumbs were eaten and the tin was passed back to the soldier who had offered it, the boys found themselves staring at their captors in a new light. They weren't sure what to make of it, this strange, unsettling moment of kindness. It had shattered their preconceived notions of what it meant to be a soldier, to be an enemy, and, most disconcerting of all, what it meant to be human. They had entered the war with clear lines between them and the British, but now, in the face of such unexpected generosity, those lines seemed to blur, fading into an uncomfortable gray. And in that moment, with their hunger momentarily satisfied and their minds swirling with confusion, the boys began to question everything they had been taught. The enemy, the ones they had been taught to hate, were not monsters. They were just men just like them. The humanity they had been denied by their own leaders was now offered to them in the form of a simple meal, and the boys could not reconcile that with the world they had once known. For the first time, they saw the war not as a battle between good and evil, but as something far more complex, far more tragic than they could have ever imagined. The silence that followed the meal hung in the air like a fog, thick with confusion and unspoken thoughts. The young German soldiers, their bellies finally sated after days of gnawing hunger, remained still as they processed what had just transpired. The food, so simple, so necessary, had not been a mere sustenance. It had been a bridge, an unexpected, unspoken gesture that altered the course of their understanding of the world they were trapped in. For the first time since the war had begun to consume them, they felt the weight of their own humanity not as something that separated them from the enemy, but as something that they shared with the very soldiers who had taken them prisoner. They were still standing in the same line, their feet frozen to the cold, uneven ground beneath them. The tension that had once gripped them with fear and anger was now replaced by an eerie stillness. The British soldiers who had been laughing just moments ago were now scattered across the street, engaged in quiet conversations, cleaning their rifles, lighting cigarettes, or simply staring off into the distance, lost in their own thoughts. It was as though the moment of laughter had lifted the veil between them and their captors, revealing the soldiers as men, just like them, caught in the same madness of war. The boy who had first stepped forward to take the bread, a fragile, gaunt figure with wide blue eyes, could hardly believe what had happened. His hands still trembled slightly, not from hunger but from the force of the realization that had struck him. This was not the enemy he had been raised to despise. These were not the cold-hearted, soulless invaders that had been depicted to him in the propaganda he had grown up with. These were men, war-weary, broken, and perhaps as much victims of the war as he was. He had been taught to believe in the righteousness of his cause, that the world was a black and white place where the enemy was evil and his side was just. But now, that belief was slipping away, slowly and painfully, like sand through his fingers. He glanced at his comrades, who were all still eating in silence, their eyes not meeting each other's but focused on the food in their hands, as though afraid to make eye contact, afraid of what they might see in each other's faces. The youngest among them, no older than 15, was chewing his bread slowly, savoring each bite, as though it were the last meal he would ever have. His eyes, which had once been filled with a fierce determination to survive, now looked empty, lost. The food had not only filled their stomachs, it had somehow made them realize the enormity of what they had been doing and the horrors they had witnessed. The faces of their fallen comrades, the bombed-out villages, the blood-soaked battlefields, seemed to close in on them, pressing down on their chests. The British soldiers, for their part, seemed to have forgotten the boys were even there. Their laughter had dissipated into the cold air, replaced by a quiet, unsettling sense of normalcy. They had already begun to clean their weapons, to prepare for whatever the next part of the war might bring. But there was no animosity in their actions, no urgency. It was as though the boys, these German soldiers, were just another part of the grim landscape, an inevitable consequence of the war. The British soldiers had been through so much, lost so much, that the sight of their defeated enemies no longer seemed to stir the hatred they had once felt. Perhaps they, too, were beginning to question what the war had made them into. The boy who had eaten the bread first was still standing, his mind whirling with questions. He wanted to ask the British soldiers, what was this? What was the meaning of all this? But the words would not come. How could they? How could he, a soldier of the Reich, ask the enemy about mercy, about understanding? Was it not the very thing he had been taught to hate? But now, in the face of the men who had given them food, in the face of the soldiers who had shared a moment of human connection with them, the boy found himself questioning everything. He wanted to understand why they had done it, why the soldiers had shown them kindness when they had every reason not to. The British soldiers, for their part, gave no answers, at least not in words. They were still going about their tasks, as if the whole moment had been as fleeting as a gust of wind. They were no longer the faceless enemy they had once been to the boys. They had become something else, human beings caught in the same tragic web of war. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there, lingering in the air, like a weight that neither side could escape. The boy glanced again at his comrades. He could see the confusion in their eyes, the same confusion that was swirling inside him. What was this? What did it mean? Were they being shown mercy? Or was this just another cruel twist of fate, a momentary kindness before their inevitable doom? They had been told so many things about the enemy, about the British, about the Allies, that it was difficult to reconcile those teachings with the reality they now faced. How could the same men who had bombed their cities, destroyed their homes, and killed their families, now offer them food and drink, without any sign of cruelty or malice. How could they be so human in the midst of a war that had stripped away every trace of humanity from everyone involved? The answers were elusive. They were not the kind of answers the boys could find in a textbook or from the mouths of their commanding officers. They were not the kind of answers that could be explained away by ideology or politics. These were answers that only the war itself could provide, and it was a lesson they would not easily forget. As the boys stood there, the realization of what had just transpired began to settle over them like a thick, suffocating blanket. It wasn't just the act of being fed, it was the quiet recognition that the British soldiers had seen them not as the enemy, not as the aggressors, but as human beings. They had extended a hand of kindness, and in doing so, they had erased the lines that had once separated the captors from the captives. The war had twisted their perception of the world, had taught them to dehumanize those on the other side. But now, in the face of such unexpected compassion, they were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that their enemies were not monsters. They were men just like them. The youngest soldier, still clutching the last remnants of his bread, looked up from his meal and caught the eye of one of the British soldiers. The soldier did not look away. Instead, he held the boy's gaze for a moment, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them. It was not a look of understanding, not yet. But it was a moment of shared recognition that they were all, in the end, just victims of a war that had claimed too much and asked too little of the men who fought it. The boy blinked, his heart heavy with the weight of the realization, but he said nothing. There was nothing to say. There were no words that could express what they had just learned, what they had just witnessed. And yet, as the British soldiers moved off to continue their preparations, the boys found themselves standing taller. They were not standing tall because they felt strong, because they were filled with renewed pride. No, it was a different kind of tallness. It was the kind of posture one assumes when they've been stripped bare of their illusions, when they have been forced to confront the full scale of their own helplessness. The world they had once known, the world of clear-cut lines between good and evil, was gone. The laughter, the food, the silent exchanges of understanding, they had all shattered the structure of their beliefs, and they were left standing in the ruins. For the first time in what seemed like forever, the boys felt as if they could breathe. It was not the relief of victory, but the relief of clarity. They no longer knew who the enemy was or what the future would hold, but they understood one thing. They were no longer just soldiers, they were human beings, and that made all the difference. The passage of time, which had always seemed so fluid and intangible during the war, now felt like a heavy anchor for the young German soldiers. Their thoughts swirled in a constant, disorienting dance, but there was one thing they couldn't escape, the realization that they had crossed an invisible line that had previously seemed so firm. They were no longer just soldiers, defined by their uniforms and their orders, their loyalty to a regime that now seemed distant and broken. No, they were something else now, and that transformation had happened not through any choice of their own, but in response to a simple, unexpected act of mercy, food shared by the enemy, given without a hint of mockery or hatred, but with an almost unsettling tenderness. As they stood there, the weight of their hunger dissipating for the moment, their minds turned inward. They had not been prepared for this. When the war had first begun, they had all been filled with a sense of purpose, a belief that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. They had been told, in the loud, stirring speeches of their leaders, that their cause was just, that the Reich's expansion was the key to their survival, to the survival of their nation. Their hands had been stained with the blood of those they had been taught to consider enemies, yet they had justified it. How could one not justify the horror when they were told it was necessary for the greater good? But now, standing in a ruined village in the middle of a war that had taken everything from them, the concept of the greater good felt hollow. A cruel lie they had been fed by the very people who had orchestrated this madness. The British soldiers, their captors, had shattered that illusion in an instant. The laughter, the food, the quiet understanding, it had all forced the boys to confront something they had never been able to grasp before, that the world was not divided so neatly into good and evil, into friends and enemies. The lines that had once defined their lives, that had made it possible for them to fight in the first place, had now become nothing more than faded scars. They had been told that the British were the enemy, that they were cold, ruthless invaders bent on their destruction. But in the wake of their captor's kindness, the boys were left to question everything they had once believed.